minutes. It's neither efficient nor practical to have the public sector making small emissions reductions at the cost of $100 a tonne, while at the same time Huntly is trebling its emissions. Now, there's a really broad consensus that the most efficient way in which to reduce emissions are broad-based price instruments. That way we make the most reductions at the least cost to our economy. Now, the debate gets a bit trickier over whether you want to have a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme. And frankly, we've been going round and round that debate for the best part of my near 20-year political career. A forest of paper has been felled in the flip-flopping between those two approaches. Now, National for the last decade has consistently backed an ETS approach for three reasons. First, an ETS mechanism is better able to deal with forestry, which particularly in the New Zealand context is a significant issue. Secondly, an ETS provides a greater level of certainty about the environmental outcome. It recognises that there is an underlying limit to the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that the atmosphere can sustain. And the third reason is this. Even if New Zealand thought, in a theoretical sense, that a carbon tax was better than an emissions trading scheme, we're 0.2% of global emissions. The EU have an ETS. Australia and the United States both has legislation in their countries for an emissions trading system, and we really would be kidding ourselves if we thought we should be swimming off in the opposite direction. But there are ETSs and there are ETSs. There is a whole range of critical design issues that can make an enormous difference. This is probably the most complex and challenging economic reform since GST, and there has been huge contention about the details. A hot debate is about which sectors and when. Actually, political life in my job is pretty predictable about what the sectors think. There's been a barraging of lobbying from the transport sector, the industrial sector, the energy sector, the waste sector, and your sector that says all the reasons why your particular sector should be last in. It's actually good policy and not politics that should resolve that question. We've applied 4 tests to that question. First, which sectors have mitigation technologies at affordable prices that will reduce emissions? Remember, the goals of the ETS is not to drive up costs, but to incentivise change. The second question is, at which rate is emissions growing in each sector, remembering that it's not the absolute emissions level that costs the government, but increases above 1990 levels. Now, the third test is how difficult is the administrative systems and compliance costs to implement an ETS to each sector. And the last test, which sectors are trade exposed so that they are at risk of just simply relocating to some other country and putting the emissions off there to no overall gain. Apply those 4 tests and you can see why National has long held the view that the energy sector should be the first cab off the rank. It's had a 120% increase in emissions. There are lots of alternatives to burning coal or gas to generate electricity, like wind, geothermal, hydro. There's no power cable that connects the grid to some other country where you're exposed to trade issues. And of course there's only 4 players, and so the administrative issues are pretty straightforward. Equally so, you can see why on a principled basis the government has determined that agriculture should be the last to be included in the scheme in 2015. Now, I must be frank with you that there are very real practical challenges in including agriculture into the emissions trading scheme. The timetable to 2013 was not realistic, and that's why we have deferred it. We are upping the effort to resolving those technical issues, and we will next year be establishing a technical advisory implementation group. We will be keeping a watching brief on international developments and mitigation technologies. Now, the hardest part of the design of an ETS is around the issue of leakage for trade-exposed industries. This is the problem of just exporting an industry jobs to other countries, and arises as a consequence of countries moving at different paces around introducing a price of carbon. Now, the common response I get is, well, New Zealand should not move until every other country moves. That's not realistic. When 90% of the increase in global atmospheric greenhouse gases has come from a small club of better off nations, it's inevitable that we are going to be expected to move first in curbing future growth. The pragmatic way to try and mitigate the risks of these trade-exposed sectors is to provide for an allocation of units. The issue is, to whom and for how much? Our approach to this differs from the previous government in three major respects. The first, the thresholds for being eligible are to be based on industry intensity levels and not an absolute level. We don't want to favour big businesses over smaller ones. The test should not be just the total tonne of emissions, but actually the amount of emissions relative to turnover of those trade-exposed businesses. The levels we have set of 1,600 tonne per $1 million turnover and 800 tonne per $1 million turnover for 90% and 60% allocations are aligned to Australia, taking into account exchange rate differences. The second change to allocations is that we're making them